Friends, colleagues, and elite gamers, welcome to another episode of Brain Buzz Podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Drake.
And today we are joined by PhD candidate in clinical psychology, associate with the Center for Gambling Research, and most importantly, friend of and returning guest on the show, Gabriel Brooks. Gabe, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here again. I'm looking forward to this.
Woo, woo, woo. Gabe, you're the first episode that was not about me and Kyle's work. So you and Mario Ferrari came on and talked about your work in gambling.
I think that was episode number 3, Mario and Gabriel talk gambling.
You got it. Yeah, you know better than us. Yeah, see, that was a big moment for us. So we got really, that was a really pivotal moment. If we didn't do that episode, we probably wouldn't be existing right now.
We help you kick it off. Although I seem to recall more alcohol being involved in the early days.
Yeah, a lot less sadness, a lot less social distancing 4 years ago, 3 years ago. But today, Gabe, we knew that your work was changing around that time. And now it's developed into a whole research line of research. So let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about loot boxes, right?
That is correct. We'll talk about loot boxes if you want. We can generally talk about other forms of gambling-like behavior in games as well, which do exist. But primarily, I focused on loot boxes this last year and a half or so.
Right on. Yeah. And so what is a loot box for our non-elite gamers out there?
It's, you think of it generally as a virtual item present in a lot of video games that you probably are paying a bit of money for. Sometimes you can earn them through gameplay, but it's quicker to buy them, using your credit card or, in-game points that you probably used your credit card to purchase. You open it and it gives you a random reward. That reward is probably going to vary in desirability. There'll be a couple really cool items that a lot of people want, and those might be, a 1% or a 5% chance you'll get them. And then there'll be a bunch of other items that, might have some use or, some aesthetic to them, but are generally less desirable, and those would be the ones you get most often.
Right. And so for people that don't play video games, Kyle and I have played our share of video games. Gabe, we've played games with you.
I've dabbled a bit.
Yeah. Why would someone want to spend more money on a video game after purchasing the game itself?
That's a good question. It's one that, if we were to frame this in the study we did conduct, we don't necessarily answer ourselves, but, maybe we'll hope to with the next project as well. But we can just hypothesize of a few different reasons. One, it depends what you can get in, say, a loot box. If you can get only aesthetic kind of cosmetic items that don't imbue a power or ability in the game, maybe it's to stand out a little bit more in multiplayer games, to make their character a little bit more unique, look a little bit cooler. If there are, power-ups that come out of these loot boxes, which some games do offer, maybe it's to, kind of buy an advantage rather than take time to earn it. So, there are clearly compelling reasons to do this because people spend a lot of money on, gamers as a whole on these systems.
And so who are the people that are spending the money on loot boxes here? I haven't spent I'm cheap, so this doesn't really count, but I will never spend money on loot boxes. But who are the individuals that are more likely to be buying these loot boxes and spending this money?
Yeah, I think, you can, what traits they have, if you look at the research we were doing, it so happens, and maybe we'll engage with this a bit later, but it associates with individuals who might also endorse some gambling related traits for those who buy the most. But if you are asking about, just generally who does, there's sort of that 80-20 rule where, with loot boxes or microtransactions more broadly within video games, you'll have a small portion of, any game's population who end up engaging the most and making it the bulk of expenditure, if you will.
So, Gabe, you mentioned microtransactions. Can you elaborate on that point a little bit? What is a microtransaction?
Yeah, so loot boxes are one form of microtransaction. And in the upcoming study we were kind of putting together, we're kind of calling those, the loot box model, which is that randomly generated reward that you don't quite know what you're getting. But more broadly, there's also what we're kind of calling direct purchase microtransactions. So there might be items in a game that, you know exactly what you're going to get, and you spend $10 to get that look for your gun or character, and you're spending $10 max because you get what you want. Whereas in a loot box model, maybe you end up spending or buying a couple dozen loot boxes, you know, 10, 20, 30, $40 to try and get an item that's rare.
Can you give us an example using like a real world concrete example? Are there particularly egregious examples of this that you reference in your paper, for example?
I don't want to frame anything as like an egregious example, but if we talk about what you can do with loot boxes, there are some games, Counter-Strike Global Offensive being quite a popular one, also PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds being another extremely popular one, where you do have these loot box mechanics. So you can spend your like probably $2, $2.50. I think in those cases you're actually buying a key to unlock the loot box, which is basically the same thing, and that will give you your random item. Now, what those games allow, I think through the Steam marketplace, which is an area people can sell virtual items, you can actually then sell the virtual item you get from that loot box. So it's possible that people might approach some of these systems within games that allow you to sell it as a way to almost make a wager. I'm going to buy this loot box, hope I get a rare item, and then I'll sell that for $1,000. Of course, if that's the approach someone is taking, in most cases, they're probably going to get an item that's worth a few cents and not, you know, some coveted $2,000 AK-47.
Right. And we talked about too before we went on, Gabe. Like, we're looking at what we call Steam charts. So just like the most popular games on this platform for computer games, and it looked like more than half of the games that are in the top 10 implement in some way either at least microtransactions or specifically loot boxes.
Yeah, so I think if you look at the way gaming has been going, the incorporation of microtransactions generally is so common now. It is, you know, I'm sure not in every game, but like many of the AAA games, you know, the most popular ones that are now released, you will have some form of microtransaction. Maybe some folks are feeling that they'd rather stick to that direct purchase model just in case regulation impairs loot boxes down the road. But as you were speaking, looking at that top 10 on the Steam charts, a lot of those games have been around for a couple of years, and a lot of those games, you know, probably 50-60% of them have that, you know, classic loot box mechanism in it.
Are players using loot boxes? Like, is there an in-game advantage to purchasing a loot box, or is it strictly cosmetic? Because I think to this point we've talked primarily about cosmetics.
Yeah,
is that right?
It definitely depends on the game. So there'll be, if you look at gaming broadly, there is sort of a group of gamers who don't like the idea of being able to buy upgrades to make yourself better in a video game. It seems kind of, you know, I suppose unfair for people who can afford, you know, to buy these upgrades perhaps. So to combat that, it seems there's a pool of games that stick to cosmetic only items, but there are other games out there. I might have trouble naming a few of them off the top of my head that
I have a couple I can think of.
Yeah, go for it.
Card games, like electronic card games, right?
There you go. Perfect.
Those are exactly like, you know, that's exactly like if you were to go to the corner store when you're younger and buy a pack of cards. You don't know what's going to be in those packs, but they basically translated that to electronic card games now,
yeah,
right?
And if you think about those card packs in our lab, we've often kind of commented that, you know, your Pokemon booster pack is sort of like a modern or a classic loot box, because you'll get 10 cards, you don't know what they're going to be, and you hope you get the Charizard.
Yeah. The coveted Charizard that every schoolyard
someone
elementary school kid wanted. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. But so I think there's two kind of perspectives here. You know, loot boxes are, the randomness of the loot boxes is linked, and what your work is looking at is linked to gambling behavior, or like gambling type behavior, right? So what did you study, and how did you test whether or not, you know, people are more likely to use or to spend money on loot boxes based on
so that's sort of the question, and definitely was the question and sort of popular concern if we go back to like 2017, 2018. Are loot boxes gambling? Are people engaging in them as a gambling behavior? But there wasn't much research out there to really concretely state one way or another. Now that's still emerging, but what we did to test that is think, well, if loot boxes are like gambling, then we might expect people who are predisposed or who engage in risky gambling behaviors might also be more likely to use loot boxes to an excessive or risky extent. So that would be the kind of behavioral component. And then we took a step further of, well, maybe they also engage with loot boxes on a psychological level, kind of cognitively, in a way similar that you might see gamblers engage with gambling. So Yeah, if you want, I could run through a couple of the findings. We have some pretty cool descriptive findings from that study as well that speak to just what gamers viewed loot boxes as.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I feel like there must be a difference between how there must be different groups of people interacting with these different, like, in different ways, right? So there's people that are like, oh, I just really want my guy or my character to look really cool, and then there's
Mhm.
others that are like, I need to get these things, I need to get all these things, and then you might have another group party that's like, I want to make money off of this because I can
Yeah.
sell these
So descriptively, we include some questions just to kind of see how it would shake out. And probably the two most clear sort of descriptive statistics we asked people, do you feel buying a loot box is like making a bet? So do they kind of equate it to gambling? And I believe it was like 75%, three quarters of our participants in both samples felt that loot boxes were akin to actually making a bet. So you're kind of seeing gamers approach these as if they are gambling in that sense, at least three quarters. We then asked, again, more bluntly, if you will, are loot boxes, or do you believe loot boxes are a form of gambling? And we got, again, like 60 to 80% across our sample buying in, saying loot boxes are a form of gambling. So just from a, you know, assessment sort of, what gamers think of this system, it seems that they believe this is a system that is gambling like, at least.
things.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
is it just spending the money? Like, so when you're asking this, I know that certain games will
mhm,
give you, that little like the little booster pack, the little freebies, just to get your appetite wet, right?
yeah.
Is this specifically, asking them if you're spending money on it? It's like putting a bet down.
Yeah, so we had, I think it was about four or five questions that sort of drilled down on that. One question was, are you familiar with loot boxes? And it was like 95%, or some
Mhm.
almost 100% were familiar with it. If you were familiar with a loot box, chances are you had also opened one. It was nearly the same percentage, and I think that gets to some of those freebies where you earn one every week through grinding it out in a game.
Right.
A lesser percentage, but still a majority, had bought a loot box, and then I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but about 30%, somewhere around there, a minority but a significant number still, had actually then engaged in those marketplaces and sold an item back.
Okay.
So we kind of
Hmm.
we kind of saw that shrinking cone of engagement from are you familiar all the way to I've engaged with it, bought them, and sold it.
Right. Yeah. So even like, a quarter of the people that are engaging in
Mhm.
this are interacting in some sort of marketplace to buy or sell
Yeah.
these items.
So if you kind of look at those stats, we see that our participants felt generally that these were kind of a gambling like behavior, but that doesn't, you can't necessarily equate that with it actually being a gambling like behavior. And so this goes to an earlier question you had of what did we do? What behavioral measures did we have to kind of assess this?
Mhm.
And we provided participants with a very common kind of gold standard measure of problem gambling, the problem gambling severity index. It's like a 9 question item that runs from 0 to 27. And if people are scoring really above, uh, you know, 5 plus, that's probably indicative of like moderate risk problem gambling. We found that that scale correlated moderately with individuals' expenditure, how much they were spending on loot boxes. So if they were someone who was spending, 20, $50, $100 a month, they were also more likely to score high on that problem gambling severity index.
Wow.
Okay. So that's problem. Like that's where I was about to kind of go to is like when does it become a problem?
Yeah, and there's been a number of other researchers, Zendel and colleagues being one, who's done a lot of work looking at loot box expenditure and the PGSI and sort of, also demonstrating that finding, which is quite robust. I would say that one caveat of loot box expenditure, unless you're taking into account participants' socioeconomic status, you might have someone who can spend $100, $1,000 weekly and be fine with that if they can afford it.
Right.
So we did also include a number of questions that assessed, what we were calling loot box risk. Are they engaging with loot boxes in a way that is risky? And these might be: do you feel excitement when you buy them? Do you feel compelled to open more after you've opened one? Do you buy more if you don't get the item you want, kind of a loss chasing, classic gambling behavior. So we condense that into this 5-question brief scale of risky loot box use. And again, that associated quite well with people's, gambling behavior as well. So that PGSI associated with risky loot box use, not just how much they were spending.
Now, here's a question that I think might put this into perspective for some. Is gambling, like loot box gambling, the same as gambling in a casino? Does the house always win, or is that adage not necessarily hold true in the online sort of loot box world?
I think that's where it gets a little bit murky, because it depends perhaps, and I think this is why I like to frame it as loot boxes appear to be gambling like, rather than definitively saying loot boxes are gambling. In a casino, you are going to wager money in the hopes of winning more money. So if you were to look at the analogy toward loot boxes, if you wanted the most strict interpretation of when loot boxes are gambling, you probably have to say that is when people are buying loot boxes with the intention to receive a valuable item to then sell for more money than they got. Yeah. Admittedly, that is not going to be the vast majority of people who engage with loot boxes. So, you could say the house or the publishers always win in that they are, always getting money from the player, and they aren't really returning that money themselves. So they're always making money off the system whenever someone buys it. But the player is typically always getting something as well. So, now is it that the player is repeatedly buying loot boxes to get a particular item that has a 1 in 1,000 probability and they'll probably never get? In that case, you might consider that individual, developing problematic use of the feature and not coming out with what they want, not winning.
Right. I guess the difference is that here, in the digital realm, the publisher is just producing content basically that costs them, apart from paying the people who actually create it, next to nothing. And so if they're making money off of it without actually spending any money, then they kind of win anyways, which I think is an interesting point.
It's not designed to be a traditional gambling system in that the publisher is going to pay out, a monetary value to the people who use it. But nevertheless, it has this system of sort of a random ratio return to the participant of desirable items. And I'm sure if you were to, I think we'll be doing this in our next study, but if you were to poll loot box users about which items they most want in a loot box, is going to be those ones that are the least common. Very few people are probably going to say they want the one that appears 20% of the time. They want the one that appears 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 1,000 times.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Do you see a relationship between people who are using loot boxes and then going on to develop problem gambling type behaviors, or is that directionality not yet established?
That's a really good question, and the directionality to that is, as far as our paper went, and as far as the papers that are currently published that I'm familiar with, has not been established yet. Most of the research on loot boxes and like these mechanisms have been cross-sectional. So, our takeaway was, you could have a bunch of third variables that might account for this, like impulsivity, although we did include that and it didn't account for it. So the two main ones would be, do you have people who are engaging in loot boxes to a risky extent? And does that make them more vulnerable to problematic gambling later on? That's an open question. The inverse of that is, do you have a bunch of people who have problems with gambling excessively engaging in the system because it's so similar to a gambling reward system? That, in my point of view, both of those kind of main hypotheses are problematic and suggest that, maybe some regulation, some work needs to be done with how the system works.
Yeah, you mentioned regulation, and I want to ask, first of all, is there regulation? Does anybody out there have any regulations in place? And then I guess second to that, why would we need to regulate this? Like, who are the people that are engaging in this behavior? And is there a vulnerable population group that we wouldn't want to be participating in these gambling-like behaviors?
Mm-hmm. So let's answer that in two ways. One, based off of that cross-sectional data that we can't make hard interpretations on. Nevertheless, we do see that some people are engaging with this to an extreme amount, and then those people are also endorsing, say our risky loot box index, suggesting that it's a problematic, probably financially harming behavior. So in that sense, you certainly do have a subgroup of people who are probably engaging in this system to an extent that is harming them. Uh, Another way we can look at this as well is thinking about youth, right? You will see anecdotal cases, and it's harder to do the research within youth populations we have in ourselves, but you'll see the anecdotal case of a young teen using their parents' credit card and racking up several $1,000s within a game. So the fact that that's possible suggests perhaps some form of regulation might be warranted. The fact that maybe gamblers who are prone to engaging in the system could, effectively financially self-harm themselves through it might be supportive of regulation, or that alternative where people then go on to engage in gambling. That would also, of course, suggest you might need some regulation.
Right. The idea being kind of like where the gaming industry is grooming children to become problem gamblers.
That is exactly sort of the, one hard interpretation that certainly needs a lot more research to back it up, but that would be kind of a worst case scenario, I would imagine.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like in the digital, like in the digital world that we live in now, it's so much easier to spend copious amounts of money and not really know the impact as a child.
Yeah.
Whereas you'd have to ask your parents for money to buy, like we said, like those Pokemon cards at the grocery store or at the corner store, right?
But now you save your parents' credit card on, your PlayStation, and then maybe the kid doesn't know what they're doing and they end up spending a bunch of money, just getting items that they think they want.
And they don't really have that. They don't value, may not know how to value money in a sense too. And so like, oh, I like this. I like my character looking cool. So I'm just going to click this button a couple times and spend $100.
And so certainly regulation is one way you could shift some of the, protection toward the publishers, but they're, modern world we're living in, much similar to as we now try to do with social media. There's probably a role and some education that can be provided to parents so they know that these systems exist, and they know that, if their child plays modern video games, they'll probably be exposed to this. So when the kid comes, hey mom, can I buy this thing, in Call of Duty on PlayStation, they have that awareness that they are giving their credit card number, it might be saved, and then their kid might be able to buy more. So having maybe parental controls within games to limit spending would be useful. Now, there was the question you had earlier about whether regulation does exist.
Yeah.
At least as of, some months ago, there's continued talk in North America that maybe there should be regulation in some form. There's been actual implementation of some regulations in other countries. I think Belgium and the Netherlands come to mind as places where, at least in 2019, that sort of design of loot boxes that we were talking about, where you can cash out items, should be prohibited. So some regions have taken protective measures, or even placed loot boxes as a system that falls under their sort of gambling jurisdiction and requires that form of regulation. So it's been slow to roll out across the world, but I think we are seeing it. Some other, I think, really sensible solutions would be to ensure all games show the probability of getting every item. If someone knows it's a 1 in 1,000 chance, rather than maybe just thinking, oh, I'll have like a 1 in 20 chance, they might spend less money. Or including things within the game, speaking to parental controls, but also self-controls of, I can set a limit on how much I can spend a week in this game, something like that. I think those would be ways to, you're not destroying and disrupting that system fully, but you are starting to regulate its use and protecting people from overspending on it.
Yeah. Two follow-up questions to that point, Gabe. One is, would a government be able to levy taxes on the money spent or money earned by the publisher if the money is coming from their population, just as they would if you went and bought a lottery ticket? So that's one question. And then secondly, one of the major problems that's been ongoing in BC for years now has been the revelation that casinos have been used in nefarious ways to launder money. is that also a concern in this digital world using loot boxes?
Yeah, those are some pretty good questions, and I'm not sure I can,
Thank you.
yeah, fully answer those. Uh,
So good that I don't want to answer them. So, but
so
Yeah,
yeah, no. If
fair
you look
enough.
at how like money laundering has occurred in casinos, you kind of know that if you place a bet, you can get some portion of that money back. That's not necessarily the case for a lot of loot box items. So, are people doing it? I have no idea. Would it be feasible to buy loot box items with ill-gotten money and then sell those virtual items as a way to launder it? Probably, but it would be very inefficient, and I'm sure there are better ways to launder money.
All right, good to know.
Yeah, pro tip to you if you're
Yeah,
pile of cash there.
with Gabe, with this and with the future of gaming, I guess is kind of what I'm thinking of. Games have changed, as have so many things over the course of the last few decades. Do we think that this is going to be a commonplace thing going forward? Because it really has shaped a lot of the way that games are set up. It used to be that you buy a game and you got what you paid for. Now it seems like you buy something that's a product and then it continues to be rolled out as more options for you to spend on every day. Do you think that that's a trajectory that we're going to it's the reality of the world, is that games are going to continue to do this because it's making them lots of money?
I mean, on average, I think that's the very clear trajectory it's going. Whether that remains in the realm of loot boxes or if that's more of that direct purchase microtransaction way, I think microtransactions are going to remain in games, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with microtransactions being in games generally, as long as there's responsible policing of it. But I think what you mentioned is something that I can tie back to some of our results as well, which speaks to gaming in general, the trajectory of it over like the last 10 years, 15 years, and what that means for risky video game use. So, I believe it's the WHO has classified like internet gaming disorder and gaming disorder being a thing. And then within the DSM-5, you have that emerging as another disorder. It's fairly clear that people can engage in video games in a way that becomes detrimental to their well-being, much like gambling. But what is interesting is the current classifications for problematic video game use are kind of from, let's say 10 years ago. They don't really include financial harms. It's more about time spent and prioritization of video games over, other social relationships or over work, things that could harm you that way. So we probably want to consider financial harms as part of the overall harm picture of video games in the modern era as we're moving forward with microtransactions. And this was sort of displayed in our results because, we included a measure of problem gaming. We also included our problem gambling severity index, and we included a measure of gambling related cognitive distortion. So kind of beliefs people have that are associated with more or less risky gambling behavior. Those gambling measures were better predictors of like risky loot box use than a measure of problem gaming. So clearly that is missing something, and that's probably that financial harm at the moment.
I want to go back to what was mentioned earlier. Drake said this about, is the gaming industry grooming children to become problem gamblers? This to me seems like the population group that a lot of people are worried about, right? Is our children being exposed to gambling at an age in which they can't comprehend it. But everything that you've said to this point speaks to the fact that these problematic gambling behaviors are occurring in fully fully cognitively functional older population groups. Do is that the case, or like what does a parent have to do here? What is the concern as a parent if your kid is getting into video games?
From our results, the other results that are out there, and then just the broader literature on microtransaction use in gaming, again, as we were talking about, it seems to be something that's here to stay. If a parent is unknowledgeable about how microtransactions work within the games their kids are playing, that obviously opens up the potential for maybe their child to bill a few too many things on the parent's credit card or what have you. So I think, part of this, much like, perhaps the new generation of parents are doing with smartphones and social media is to have an awareness of what is in modern video games, how their child engages with these video games, and if spending money is possible within them, to make sure that the proper parameters are set, or they talk to their child about responsible use. So I think there is a role for the parent to educate themselves on these systems.
Definitely.
Yeah, certainly there has to be some onus and responsibility placed on the parent to watch over what their kids are engaging in, just in the same way that you would in any other anything else
Yeah.
you wouldn't want your kid doing, right?
Yeah, and it's an omnibus approach, right? That would be one aspect. You want that education to exist within families where video games are played. You probably also want some tools or regulations or methods to limit spending that the publishers provide within the game as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes good sense.
Gabe, before we wrap up, are there any common myths or misconceptions related to loot boxes, video gaming, gambling that you've noticed since you've started this work on loot boxes?
Common myths? That's a good one. I'm not sure about that. I think
it's so new. It's such a new topic, right?
Perhaps one way to look at this, if we talk about this in the sense of it being something that can be problematic, right? But for most people, it is not problematic. If you were to look at our data, most people aren't spending a ton of money on these features. So while as researchers, we are concerned about the well-being of people, and that makes us shift focus to these correlations, these associations that are driven by the people who are spending the most. Not everyone is burning through their life savings playing video games. Some people certainly are, and that's why regulation needs to exist, to protect vulnerable individuals. But a lot of people probably are using these responsibly or not engaging with it at all. So maybe there's a myth of over-pathologizing some of the monetary systems that exist. Now, loot boxes might be a particular system that are designed in a way to increase the likelihood someone engages with them pathologically.
Right. They might be
predatory. They
might be predatory in nature, right? For sure. Yeah, I think that's what everything. I mean, I feel like the world is just different predatory tactics to get people's money, right? And I think that you just have to acknowledge that that's the case.
Exactly. And do what you can and have people do what they can. In the cases where it does have a very strong resemblance to gambling, like those systems where, CSGO, you buy your box, you open it up, you get a rare item or a less rare item, and then you sell it on the marketplace. Should that style be allowed to remain? I think that's still an open question, but it certainly increases the risk because people might feel that they can get reimbursed for the money they're spending, when in reality, what they are getting back will probably be less than their purchase price.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think an interesting point too is just one thing that we haven't really approached more or less is that you can bulk buy these things as well, right? It's not like you're purchasing one at a time. You can purchase hundreds at a time.
Yeah,
and that's where it can be particularly it's a problematic situation, but it's also it's easy to rack up those hundreds of dollars immediately just with one click.
Yeah, I mean, go on YouTube or Twitch and search for a streamer who has bought 100 or 1,000 loot boxes to open them all at once to, see what they'll get. Having people watch that, I'm not sure it's going to discourage loot box use. And there are actually, there's at least one recent study that has demonstrated, similar to gambling, physiologically, I think it's through a galvanic skin response and heart rate, you see a similar pattern that you do in gambling when people are opening loot boxes, and that response is larger for rarer items. So you're kind of seeing that physiological response, excitement, in response to this system. And that might encourage people to then buy more, right? Feeling compelled, like one of our questions is, to buy more loot boxes afterward. If you compare that to the, let's call it again, the direct purchase model, you buy one, you got it, you know what you got, you're done. You're probably not going to immediately buy another because you didn't get what you want, since you know what you got.
Right. Yeah. You're very conscious of what you're purchasing versus, just guessing and hoping.
Exactly. Yeah. So, yeah. And if we go back to those two primary interpretations, one being maybe loot boxes are sensitizing people to engage in gambling behavior, or that vulnerable gamblers are predisposed to engage with these. Maybe I'll be the guest that returns a third time down the road, but we're about to launch a study that hopefully will shed some light onto that.
Awesome.
Fantastic. Well, I'll look forward to reading that when it's done. Maybe you'll give us the heads up, and we'll get you back for that coveted Triple Crowned episode.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Fantastic. Great. With that, we'll wrap up another fantastic episode of Brain Buzz. You can follow Brain Buzz on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to our newsletter at brainbuzzpod.com. And as well, you can join us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BrainBuzzPod. Until next time, cheers.
Cheers.